emotion, volition, willpower. How does that keep you connected, attached to the world in various ways? We'll look at that in its role in early Buddhism coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you ring the bell down below, I was going to say downstairs, you will get notifications when I come out with new videos and so on. There's also, I should say, I have a new course up on the Online Dharma Institute about the Buddha's teaching to lay people. So if that interests you, I have a link down below to that course. And of course, other courses over there as well on early Buddhism that might interest you if you want to take a deeper dive into the Dharma. John Shaw asked a question a while ago about the role of volition, of will, in willpower, volition, emotions, in karma, in dependent origination, in keeping us attached to the world and in producing eventually a dukkha, or our sense of unsatisfactoriness that is at the heart of the problem the Buddha saw with our lives, and that he found, he believed, a solution to. So the role of volition in particular in the chain of dependent origination, this chain that keeps us attached to the world and that keeps us in sort of in bondage to suffering, if you like. That's a little bit of an extreme way of putting it, but it certainly is true for the early texts. Volition plays a very great role in this chain. But first of all, what is the chain of dependent origination? The chain of dependent origination is a theory, a causal process that the Buddha believed that he had found, that he had discovered, rediscovered, if you like, and that basically highlighted the way that dukkha or pain, suffering, unsatisfactoriness arose in life through a causal process. Through a causal process in which we were involved intimately. And there are there's not just one example of this chain in the early texts, there are various similar examples of this chain. I did an earlier video on dependent origination. I'll put a link to it here up on the screen. If you want, you can go there and see that first and come back, or look at this video and then look at that as well. This video should be somewhat self-contained. I won't go through the entire 12 links because, as I say, there are various different ways the chain is presented in the early text. The longest and most famous is the 12-link chain, which I'll be basically discussing today. So volitions basically play a large role in this 12-link chain. They appear at 3 different places in that chain, 3 or 4 depending on how you count them. The first of these is in the second position. So the chain begins, the origin of this 12-link chain is in ignorance. So we begin at a place of, we might say, cosmic or ontological or metaphysical ignorance, this stuff that is always with us since the beginning of time. For a traditionalist and for the Buddha himself, beginningless lifetimes in ignorance is how we persist. We might say as well, from a more bounded kind of this life kind of view, that ignorance is simply a fact of our own lives. We are ignorant of so many things. We always act out of ignorance to a degree. And so from ignorance, that is the first link in this chain, comes volitions, volitional formations. The Pali word is sankharas, which is a very weighted and freighted word which has lots of connotations, which I won't go into because they're not really relevant, take too long. But the point is that these involve what's called volitional formations, our emotional life, our emotions, our willpower, our decision making. It all comes out of ignorance, basically, for the Buddha. So we're in a kind of an existential dilemma here, where we know that we're ignorant. We don't know the right way to act. We're not awakened yet. And yet, existentially, we have to act in the world. There's no other way around it. If we don't act, we're going to die. And we're certainly going to hurt other people as well through inaction. So we're in this kind of dilemma. And that's really where the Buddha begins this chain. And it's that kind of acting out of ignorance that keeps us in this kind of bondage, that keeps us in a place of suffering, that keeps us in a place where nothing quite seems right. Because we're not really doing the right thing most of the time, or we're not really doing what we're doing with the right mindset most of the time. So that's the first place that we find volitions occurring in this chain of dependent origination, this 12-link chain. Then we find it later on in the 8th and 9th positions. These are the positions where we talk about craving and clinging. Craving and clinging are both forms of volition. They're volitional formations. They're forms of what we also might understand as emotions or motivations. Because all of these involve volitions. Emotions themselves are, at least in the Buddhist understanding, volitional. That is, they're the kinds of internal mental states that push us towards certain kinds of actions and away from other kinds of actions. So, for example, we have this emotion of anger, of greed. And it may be a sort of a diffuse emotion. It's not really necessarily picking out one particular thing, but it's something in the background that pushes us in particular directions that may be not to our benefit. So craving and clinging, they arise in this 12-link formula through contact with things in the world that produce feelings. So in the Buddha's understanding, again in this chain of dependent origination, our senses, let's say our vision, our hearing, our taste, our touch, so on, make contact with items in the world, objects in the world. So we see nice things, or we hear nice things, or we taste good things. And those touches, those contacts, produce feelings. Now, the feelings here are not meant to be emotions. These are either positive or negative. That is to say, they're either pleasant or unpleasant kinds of feelings. So we see certain things and they're very pleasant. A nice photograph or a nice painting. We see other things that are unpleasant, say some garbage by the side of the road. And these differences are caused to arise in us craving and clinging. So we crave what is pleasant to us. And the other side of that is that we're aversive to what is unpleasant to us. So for example, we may crave the beautiful car, or the nice painting that we see in a gallery somewhere, or a good meal that we've read about in some online blog post. We think, oh, I crave that because it sounds like the sort of thing that would give us pleasure. And that is a form of volitional formation. It's something that's pushing us in a particular direction. And when we have it, let's say we've possessed we've bought the painting or bought the car, then we cling to it. We don't want to let it go. Or if it's a passing thing, like a vacation that we're on, that we're enjoying, we cling to it in the sense that we don't want it to leave. We feel a pain when the thought comes to our mind that there's going to be a final day of this vacation. We're going to have to go back to work again. On the other hand, we're aversive to things that give us displeasure, that give us pain, that we don't like the look of, a crack in the wall in our house, some paint that's flaking, that we're aversive to it. We want it to go away. And I would say one of the similar things to clinging, we're craving and clinging if we like something, where we are aversive to things we don't like, the equivalent to clinging might be a sort of ill will or anger. So that if something persists and still gives us displeasure, then our tendency to sort of pull away from it can change and sort of curdle into a kind of anger and hatred. Things that were simply annoying at a month ago, now they create in us a kind of visceral dislike. We get angry when we look at that crack in the wall that's been there. We get angry when we think about that dent in our car that hasn't been fixed properly. And that's one of the ways, one of the typical ways for the Buddha that anger and hatred arise, is through these kinds of sense pains, pains through our senses that either we are experiencing in the present or that we're thinking about, that we sort of mull over, that we obsess over. This is one of the things that takes us out of the present moment. I did a recent video on mindfulness meditation. It's sort of keeping us in the present moment. And one of the things that takes us out of that present moment are these kinds of obsessions about one thing that just makes us irritated, angry, hate-filled because it just hasn't been fixed and is giving us displeasure. So this is, anyway, these are ways also that volitions, will, decision-making are critical in keeping us attached to the world. And in a karmic fashion, at least for traditional Buddhism, in a karmic fashion it extends over lifetimes. We'll get to that in a minute as well. But also in a karmic fashion sense of this very life, that a thing that an attachment that we have right now will cause us pain perhaps in a day or a week. Let's say we're on that vacation, it'll cause us pain in that day or week when we have to leave. And the last example of where these sankharas, where these volitional formations occur in this 12-link chain of dependent origination, is in the stage after clinging. After clinging is a word which is variously translated either as becoming or as existence, and it itself creates birth. So it goes from clinging to existence to birth. Now, there are various ways of understanding what that really means. Because it's, when I just say it in those ways, clinging causes existence, which causes birth, that may be confusing to many of you, and for every reason in the world. There are two ways, I would say, of interpreting this. One is a traditional way. The traditional way is that this clinging reifies itself or becomes more deep in a clinging to life itself, clinging to not wishing to die, to not wishing to go out of existence in some understanding of what our self is. And so this clinging to our self, clinging to an idea of self, causes us, brings into us a volition, a sankhara, a motivation for existence. And so this motivation for existence then itself causes us to be reborn. In other words, it brings into being our next birth in our next lifetime. So we have this kind of volitional formation that grows up within us through our own clinging to life, to our clinging to ourself or our idea of ourself, that brings us into rebirth in the next lifetime. Now, on a more, I would say, this life understanding or interpretation, if you like a more secular interpretation, we can say that this has to do with the creation of a false sense of self. As we know in Buddhism, the idea of non-self, I have a video on non-self in case you're interested, this notion that whatever we look at in experience is not our self. We tend to identify ourselves with various aspects of our own experience. None of them really is our self. Indeed, our self is not really to be found insofar as what we mean is a permanent, unchanging sort of thing. All that we are is a constantly changing constellation of mental and physical events. And so what we tend to do is cling to an aspect of that changing constellation of mental and physical events. Let's say we cling to an idea of ourself as a person with a particular job, let's say, a Dharma teacher, let's say, or a bus driver, or a taxi driver, whatever it might be. We cling to our self as somebody who has a particular job. And that causes existence, or that, I should say, is the existence. It is that volitional formation that comes up as we cling to our status, let's say, as someone with a job, as someone with a particular job. Perhaps it's somebody with a powerful job, so we cling to that status as being powerful, as being somebody in charge and in control. That existence then that brings us into existence, it causes our birth as a sort of a person with that job, as a self with that particular job. And then birth itself brings, in the later stages of this chain of dependent origination, all of the problems that come with birth. That is to say, old age, sickness, death, dukkha, basically the unsatisfactory nature of life. Because we're clinging to something, we're bringing into existence something that is going to pass away. Nothing exists forever, nothing persists forever. So by clinging, by having this volition for existence, by bringing this thing into birth, this notion of a permanent self that is this CEO or this bus driver or this Dharma teacher, when anything goes wrong, let's say you make a mistake, you get into an accident as a bus driver, you you sell your company to the wrong company as a CEO, you make a mistake as a Dharma teacher, you make an error about the Dharma, all of a sudden that sense of self decays, and that happens all the time. It's coming and going. And that sense of self decays, you go into illness, into death, you have to deal with the problems of life, the problems of birth. And that's what keeps us chained to this kind of cycle of births and deaths. Because the clinging remains, and we have to deal with it in the next lifetime. Whether it's a literal lifetime in a future life, if we're a traditional believer, or whether it's simply another iteration of who we think ourselves to be in this lifetime. So the problem through all of this is one of craving and clinging, and in particular craving and clinging to ideas of a self. This stuff stems from ignorance, we saw in the very first stage. It stems from a kind of primordial ignorance of not knowing the way things are. And so what is the way out? The way out, then, is to begin a practice of combating that ignorance by trying to understand who we really are, or more accurately, who we really aren't. That we really aren't any of these things. That is to say, we should try to foster a more selfless kind of practice. An understanding where we ourselves are always changing, that nothing that we cling to is going to persist forever, so that we should, as a result, relax around that clinging. We should begin to relax around craving. We should begin to see our way out of craving and clinging, of identifying ourselves with things in the world that we cling to. And this is a long-term process, this is a gradual process, but the point of the practice is to get ourselves to a place in particular where contact with things in the world, where pleasant and unpleasant experiences cease to bring up in us these kinds of cravings and clingings. Because cravings and clingings aren't necessary. We can sit with the pleasant and unpleasant without necessarily craving them. Again, a long process that we're going to start simply by craving things a little bit less, by seeing the problems in craving, and so sitting with the positive, sitting with the negative in meditation, and being aware of them arising and passing, and letting them arise and pass on their own without craving. That's one of the fundamental practices, I think, of mindfulness meditation. So if you find this useful, check out my Patreon page or my courses over on Online Dharma Institute. If you're interested in a deeper dive, the Patreon page is great to help support the channel, the work I'm doing here, and help us make a little community of practitioners. Give it a thumbs up if you like it, share this video with other people who might be interested, and I hope we'll catch all of you on the next one of these videos. Meanwhile, be well.